Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this Lunch and Learn on community resilience in the face of climate change. Our speaker, Judy East, co-chairs the Community Resilience Planning, Public Health, and Emergency Management Working Group of the Maine Climate Council. She's also the Executive Director of Maine's Land Use Planning Commission. Next slide. My name is Kathleen Meal. I've had the honor of working with Judy on the Climate Council Steering Committee, and I'm also the Director of Policy and Partnerships at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations work to protect Maine's environment and our democracy by building diverse coalitions, influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. Next slide. A few technical notes for today's event. You are all muted, but we do want to hear from you. Please send your questions to me through the chat as they occur to you. You can find the chat by hovering your mouse over the bottom of the screen. We'll keep track of the questions to ask Judy during the Q&A session at the end. If you're having any technical difficulties, please message Will Sedlak through the chat function at the bottom of your screen for help. This event is being recorded, and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, along with recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thank you for joining us, and Judy, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Kathleen. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to start sharing my screen. So, screen, how's that? Got that?
We do not, Judy.
Oh, you have to press the button. Okay, there, that should do it. So as Kathleen said, thank you. I'm the co-chair of the Community Resilience Planning, Public Health, and Emergency Management Working Group. We have been called the Uber group, the super group, because we're kind of all a bunch of different areas that are related, but as we discovered through the course of our work, somewhat distinct. And as we go through the slides, you'll see how we dealt with the fact that we're covering a large area of subject matter here. So here's the working group membership. There were over 50 of us. I was co-chair along with Dr. Nirav Shah, who we all know and love from the last several months. He was called away, and Rebecca Boulos from the Maine Public Health Association stepped in very ably and co-chaired along with Ann Fuchs from the Maine Emergency Management Agency. She's the Hazard Mitigation Officer for the state. As you can see from the cross-section of people on the working group, we had representation from academia, from within state government, municipalities, a lot of nonprofits, regional planning agencies. So it was legislators as well. So we had a really good cross-section and abundant participation throughout the course of our work, which, just to recap, started as a working group last November and came right up until our presentation of our final recommendations in June. This presentation, by the way, is pretty much the same thing that was presented at the Maine Climate Council meeting in June. We'll see if we manage to convey the same message similarly, but if you were at that meeting, you're going to see some repeat here. So our process was to essentially work in 3 subgroups across the larger group. There were times when we met together and spent the first hour to sort of bring ourselves up to the same level of understanding on issues, and then we would break apart into subgroups, come back and report and see where we all were. This helped us to understand overlap and make sure we weren't duplicating. And by the way, we also did that to a certain extent with the Coastal and Marine Working Group, to be sure as we were progressing through at the beginning that, okay, you're covering this, we're covering that, let's not duplicate, and be sure that we cover the ground. So, and then there was also some cross-cutting issues later on that we discussed at the Climate Council level, and there will probably be more of that as this whole project is integrated going forward. So we had tremendous support from the Science and Technical Subcommittee as we progressed through our work. There were monthly meetings, by the way, and then a lot of individual sub-meetings between the times that we all met together. Public engagement was, I wouldn't say derailed completely, but more challenging. We thought in April and May we would be doing a lot of outreach, one-on-one, on the road, person to person. That became, as we all had to adapt, a virtual format. And so we did still succeed in, across the three groups, having about a couple of dozen stakeholder outreach meetings. So we covered, you know, meeting with planners, meeting with youth, meeting with urban and rural. That was in collaboration with the Transportation Working Group, emergency managers, public health professionals. So because that was truncated a bit, these outreach meetings in the summer are intended to get additional input. We will be asking for your input today, both in this format and with surveys, more on that later. But I would say roughly about 60% of the outreach we wanted to achieve was done as we developed the recommendations, and then there's another sort of 40% of what we're helping to do or seeking to get input on through the summer. And for this is one of them. We also met with the Climate Change Adaptation Providers Network, which I'm happy to say has expanded from what was sort of state agencies, nonprofits, to include more regional planning agencies. We've got 2 more meetings planned with municipalities. There will be evening meetings, which should make it easier for them to participate. And then another one in September with the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership. So, and there may be more that public health and emergency management are doing. I'm not quite aware of that, but I'm happy to say, and I should have acknowledged, Rebecca Boulos is on the call today. So I'll be giving the presentation, and if there's detailed questions about the public health work, she is available. I don't think Annie's available from Maine Emergency Management today, but if you are, Annie, we'll absolutely pull you in. I don't see the participant list right now as I'm speaking, but we will make sure to pull in Annie if she's here. So here are our terms of reference, if you will. The Community Resilience Planning Group chose to apply a climate lens to policy, regulatory, fundraising, decision-making issues. And our focus in that was very much the municipalities. This is community resilience planning, helping them or figuring out how we would, and continue to help them understand, prepare for, and adapt to changing climate. Public health group was looking at this very much more from, I would say, an individual and public health institutional framework to develop policy and recommendations for adaptation, preparedness, and so on. And it included human as well as animal and environmental health. And then emergency management, their focus was on our biggest, highest risk infrastructure. So think the sewage treatment plants and transportation infrastructure along the coast, as well as the inland issues associated with extreme weather events, specifically precipitation. So getting into the strategies, here's a summary, a very high-level summary of the 8 strategies that the 3 subgroups came up with. Because I'm most familiar with community resilience planning with our group, I'm going to focus on that in a little more detail. And I will mention, what the other two groups came up with. And if there are some specific questions, Becca is on the line and she can certainly update, correct, add value that I don't necessarily have. So, so to get into the detail, I don't need to read these to you now, but let's get into the detail of the Community Resilience Planning R3 recommendations. You know, broad brush, the way I look at this, it is the rules, help with them, and money, and help with money too. So the first strategy was to initiate this comprehensive review of Maine laws to achieve resilience and economic security in the face of climate change. So I say we initiate, we say that this needs to be done, but we also, we started the process. So there's an appendix to our recommendation where we had subgroups to our subgroup, where we pulled in people from regional planning agencies and state agencies to help us, what I call sort of capture the wisdom in the room, where we looked at 9 different existing statutes and their associated regulations that affect land and water, especially where they meet, and how they could be changed, updated, refined, integrated to have consistent and science-based definitions, again, with the advice of the Science and Technical Committee, how we could really examine how we would minimize the compliance burden so that applicants, permitting and compliance staff, everyone throughout the whole chain, it's just easier to implement adaptation responses. And to coordinate any of those changes with robust technical assistance and training. And that's the purpose of the graph to the right. All 3 of our strategies really hang together. I'm sorry there's a chainsaw running. If you can hear it, tell me and I'll close the window. I didn't know there'd be a chainsaw running. So again, these are interrelated. They hang together. One really doesn't move forward without the other. So the second one being this improvement to the delivery system of technical assistance, our focus is very much municipalities. So the map on the right shows you an analysis that we did to look at, well, what's the capacity now? So the dark blue is where you've got in-house planning staff. We canvassed all of the, the towns and the regional planning agencies. Is there in-house planning staff? And also good, solid regional support. So the dark blue, yes. Lighter blue, there's in-house planning staff and some support at the regional level. The yellow, it's really just at the regional level. And then the orange and the red is where you don't have any in-house staff and you've got relatively thin support or knowledge and capacity at the regional level. So you can see we've got some room to move and improve here. So our recommendations had to do with expanding state technical assistance to communities, so beefing up what's available at the state level, supporting regional delivery because we could achieve some efficiency there, sharing knowledge and so on. And one of the things that I want to really stress by the very last bullet is there's a lot of knowledge out there already that we can really leverage expertise that already exists in the nonprofit, private, and academic sectors. So further on this second strategy to improve the system of the delivery system, we talked several times about the fact that we don't want to recreate a whole new governing structure for this. We want to integrate change, whether it's for understanding your vulnerabilities or doing something about them. Integrate that knowledge and that assistance into existing plans, regs, governance structures, and to incentivize municipalities to designate point people. We also had that at the state level too. There's a huge difference, inland, coastal, all up and down the coast, in terms of a municipal understanding of the impacts of climate and whether they have the capacity to do much about it. So we really want to recognize that we need to scale support to the needs of the communities where they are at now, and to understand, as we say, one size does not fit all. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. There's a good system, a network of professionals out there already, but we do need to give them some more support. And then the final point here I wanted to stress is that there's a lot of work that's been done. It needs to be better, more accessible, and that's the notion of a clearinghouse, and to use case studies so that people can, municipalities who haven't worked in this area much can really understand, look at a nice, cogent summary and say, okay, this is who I call, these are the consultants who know this realm, these are the funding sources, and this is how I move from A to B. Because you've got volunteers and very busy people. And so that was the real stress that we put into this strategy. The third strategy had to do with money. And this is always a work in progress. The two areas, the way we separated this was in terms of efficiencies and coordination and incentives, and then some research into what are the money sources that are out there. It was abundantly clear to us in the beginning, September, when the Climate Council was formed, that we needed to be efficient. But with the economic reality that we are facing, that with COVID, it's just that much more significant and important for us to be as efficient and to coordinate as much as humanly possible here. Lots of recommendations around incentivizing to cooperate regionally. Yet again, a clearinghouse of funding programs, helping people navigate that. That's already, by the way, well underway. And then giving preference to people who really take a look at what their vulnerabilities are and then are ready to move. Some of the funding sources have to do with being more creative and flexible in existing sources like TIFs, that's tax increment financing districts, that allow you to finance resilience projects as well as the typical sidewalks, streetlights, and so on that TIFs can support. Pursuing a climate resilience bond, there are some great examples which our research identified. I've mentioned here Massachusetts and Rhode Island, but the Connecticut Green Bond Bank is also another really good example. And then I'm going to go down into further detail here. I want to really point out the very last point, which is the State Infrastructure Climate Adaptation Fund. That is the primary recommendation of the emergency management subgroup, which I'll describe a little later. And the reason I stress this one is that there is a huge demand for some of the infrastructure upgrades that we need. And the toughest thing for municipalities to come up with often for large federally funded projects is that local cost share. And that's the real point of that State Infrastructure Climate Adaptation Fund. And then this final point over at the bottom of establishing a Maine Climate Corps, that came out of one of the outreach meetings with the public health group, where it was, let's figure out how to achieve workforce development and to train the next generation of the climate professionals. And as we discussed this, after our outreach, we come back into the large group. I mean, that idea just fired on all cylinders for everybody in the group in terms of just the potential there. I mean, think of the sectors that climate touches. It's real estate, it's finance, it's construction, it's the trades, it's you name it. It touches so many different sectors, and I think there's enormous potential to link economic recovery with climate adaptation and resilience in this one idea, and it's one of my favorites. So moving to the public health strategies. This Venn diagram that Becca put together is a really good summary to identify how in addressing climate change and improving public health and strengthening the economy, there's so much overlap in the recommendations that they came up with. So yes, there's some things on the periphery, but when you think about equity, public health systems, jobs, finance, resilience, how our infrastructure affects public health, walkability, the linkages over to transportation. I mean, just so much comes together in that center sweet spot, if you will, that really addresses public health, climate, economy in this pandemic world we are stuck in for the time being. So the 4 strategies in public health. The first one has a real focus on monitoring, so we know what the issues are that we're facing, and then helping people adjust their behavior with that monitoring and with investments in both the monitoring and the education. So in terms of this relationship to the community resilience planning recommendations, whereas our focus in the technical assistance with municipalities, this is a lot more sort of one-on-one. It's still community-based, but it also gets right down to the individual. And this is more detail on the kinds of investments that are recommended here. So it's air quality monitoring, harmful algal bloom monitoring, what's going, the expansion of these vector-borne diseases, like ticks, and water testing, I think is super important, because these extreme precipitation events are causing more flooding, but that's not just overwhelming culverts, that can overwhelm wells. So there's a real important foundation in just knowing what the issues are, and then providing education to individuals and communities about what their responses need to be. This 5th recommendation out of the public health group had to do with, again, public education about what these climate change health impacts actually are. So, whereas before the 4th strategy is monitoring what the issues are, this is more clearly related to, let's get clear, consistent messaging out there about what the health effects are, and to help people make choices around adaptation. And I really like the last bullet here. We always use this term heat pump as though it's only something in the winter, but if you make that investment, and there are a lot of rebates in those investments available now, you've also got air conditioning, which with this summer becomes quite relevant. Okay, the 6th strategy has to do with just reducing the impacts of these high intensity weather events. And it has to do with preparedness. And now here again is that linkage between the 3 subgroups. So when you talk about being prepared for high intensity weather and what impact it might have on your drinking water or with sewage overflows, and then all the impacts that can have on shellfish and economically and all of that, you're talking about emergency management. So this is a more on the side of having the individuals, the businesses, and the towns increase their capacity to prepare. So really good crossover here, where the public health strategy augments the emergency management focus. And I guess I'll just stop for a minute and mention that with COVID, we were quite challenged with our group because, we're in a public health emergency and have been for 4 months. So it's remarkable that I think the public health folks and the emergency managers got done what they did get done in the face of having to also deal with this pandemic. So just a shout out for the amazing work that they did. So the last strategy for public health had to do more with the on the mitigation side, that is reduction of greenhouse gases, because the hospital sector, if you will, is big, and there are significant greenhouse gases emissions associated with institutions of that size. And so this has to do with encouraging and incentivizing and educating that whole infrastructure of public health institutions and infrastructure in developing systems, both to adapt to extreme weather, but also to think through reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And so finally, this State Infrastructure Climate Adaptation Fund strategy of the Emergency Management Subgroup. This is the single strategy from the Emergency Management Group, which please don't interpret to mean they didn't do a lot of work, because embedded behind this is an enormous amount of research and data assembly of what our infrastructure vulnerabilities are and where, especially with respect to sewage treatment plants along the coast and vulnerable transportation infrastructure, where we are most vulnerable. And their analysis is very detailed. If and when you go and download the full detail of their recommendations. So, as I mentioned before, I think the real power of this idea is that it would provide state funding that municipalities could draw on in order to then be eligible and competitive in the federal realm in order to address significant vulnerabilities that affect not just their town, but the region within which we all live. There's additional detail here about increased participation in flood program, community rating system. We also had that within the community planning, resilience planning work group. This slide is a really good representation out of the emergency management group, just to finish the presentation. If you look over on the left, this is true in this particular instance with the Saco Water Resource Recovery Facility, where if you spend money on the engineering and on the proposed adaptation, you're spending so much less money than the cost of doing nothing if there's catastrophic failure. And that ratio of spending money on planning ahead of time is true, and therefore saving money in disaster is true wide. And I believe the ratio is 6. For every dollar you spend ahead of time, you're saving $6 later. And with the increasing frequency of natural disasters that we're seeing nationwide, that money just, I mean, the math there just does not lie, and is hugely significant. And the emergency management subgroup has done a lot of research and work to document the value and the rationale for spending money up front in order to avoid, well, spending money later, but also the impacts of catastrophic failure. So I'm going to leave it there with this final slide that directs you to climatecouncil.maine.gov. And I want to point out 3 things. One is all of the detailed strategies for our working group, and all the working groups are there. You'll find them. So you can dig into every detail that I didn't have a chance to cover. Also, all of the video presentations from the June Climate Council meeting are on each of the working group web pages. So you can watch the presentations that were provided in June. You can then download a toolkit about, what we're proposing here. And then on each of the working group web pages where the strategies are, at the bottom, you can take a survey. So there's actually 6 surveys. And then I believe there's also a larger general survey that you can take. So in addition to what I hope we will gain from you today, I'll be taking notes and so on, and this is recorded. I highly encourage you to go to those web pages and take those surveys, because they're being assembled now. They will be fully packaged and presented to the Climate Council in September for the meetings on the 9th and the 16th. So the opportunity to have input is indeed right now. And I think I'm going to leave it there. And yippee, I only took a half an hour, Kathleen. So we've got a half hour, and I'm going to stop sharing and pop it back over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Judy. Judy mentioned those surveys on the Maine Climate Council's website, and we are asking you all today to take a few moments to check out the strategies that this working group and all of the working groups proposed, and to take some time to fill out those surveys about how those strategies could fit in your community. We'll send out the link in an email later this afternoon. And as Judy said, this is really one of the primary forms of input into the new climate action plan. So please take some time to weigh in. We had a ton of great questions come in while you were presenting, Judy, and I'm going to walk us through some of those. Everybody else, feel free to keep those questions coming, and we'll make the most of this time together. Let's start with a quick sort of clarification. You mentioned the community rating system. Can you say a little bit more about what that is?
Sure. It is a system that was developed and exists by the National Flood Insurance Program, or FEMA. I think it's an add-on to the National Flood Insurance Program. And it is a system by which, and by the way, you can get links to it and get all of the detail if I've got some of the details wrong, but broad brush, it is a system by which a municipality can formally answer a lot of questions around what their level of preparedness is. So it's a full examination of what ordinances they have in place, what personnel they have in place, whether they are part of the flood insurance program nationally, and a whole host of other questions where you examine your capability to respond to flood events. And when you have gone through that process, you are then there's a scale and I'm not going to get these details exactly right, but there's a way of putting you into a category that you've gone through the process, you're rated according to it, and the real benefit of it is that you can then have a reduction in the flood insurance premiums within your community. So that's the real benefit of it. In addition to, that's the financial benefit to individual landowners. The process of looking through and examining your preparedness is also, that's benefit just in and of itself. But it would be in the technical assistance strategy, I believe, there's a link, in one of the footnotes that'll take you right to sort of chapter and verse and how your community can then follow up. And the Maine Flood Management Program, Sue Baker is the manager of that program at the state level. She can absolutely walk you through the individual requirements of that program.
That's really helpful, thank you. And Brian Ambritt from the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation and the Future put a link into the chat. So thank you, Brian, I really appreciate that. Judy, folks on the call are wondering if there are projects happening now at the local level that you're really excited about, that you think, you know, some of these added resources and supports might make it easier for us to scale up to other communities?
Yeah, really good question, and that's the point around case studies that I was making. And again, within, hey Brian, if you could do me a favor, pop the Municipal Planning Assistance Program link into the chat. That'd be awesome, because in the Municipal Planning Assistance Program on their web pages, you can link to the case studies of completed projects that were funded through mostly shore and harbor grants and coastal communities grants. That's coastal program, usually NOAA funds that come into the state and then are granted out to municipalities through the Shore and Harbor and the Coastal Communities Grant Program. Thank you, Brian. And what you can find there in the case studies are what I was referring to as a nice, tight, 2-page summary of this is what we did, this is the mapping we did, these are the consultants we used. You get quotes from municipal officials, descriptions of the approach that was taken, and they're all up and down the coast. So that'll give you a really good idea of sort of transferable knowledge, and I would highly recommend checking those things out. You know, I could go into quite a lot of detail about the project in Machias. I don't know if we want to go into that just yet. Let's see if there's other questions.
Fair enough.
That's
fair enough.
My own personal favorite. But
well, we can, at the very least, we can look for that case study when we follow the link, right?
It's in process. They're working on it now.
Oh, it's in process. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Anyway.
Well, we'll have to follow up with that one. Let's see
what else is going on. Yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned the federal sort of grants and re-grants that make those possible through some of the programs you mentioned. Is that the main way that municipalities are financing these community resilience projects, or are there other funding sources that we should know about?
Well, let's see. There's state and federal money. The biggest pots are federal, yes. Sort of direct access to federal money. And then there's also the channeling of federal through the states to the towns. But to sort of give the range of what's available at the state level now, and that I think is having some of the biggest impact. The Shore and Harbor grants and the Coastal Communities grants, those are granted every year. So the program statements come out in the spring, and they were just announced, actually. The Coastal Communities grants were just announced. The Shore and Harbor are being reviewed right now. Those are on the range of, Shore and Harbor is up to 30,000, Coastal Communities up to 100, but they don't have much money, so it's usually somewhere closer to like 40 to 60,000 is my experience. What they do primarily is assess vulnerability, help with design and engineering, and get you to the point where you're ready to apply for the implementation money, the big bucks, if you will. So the amount of money that's available at the state level through those two programs is more on the getting yourself ready as opposed to building things. However, in addition to those, the Maine DEP, I think we're in the third round of the what's called the Stream Crossing Bond Program, or I've called the shortcut the Culvert Bond, as it's been called. And that's been funded by bonds at the, you know, when we go to the polls, and then issued 3 times. And my previous life was being a regional planner in Washington County. And we applied for that money multiple times in inland and coastal communities. And that's where you start to actually have some money that lets you construct things. So the total grant awards have been $95,000, which usually is enough, unless it's a very complicated situation, to actually get the project done. There's no absolute need for a match. You often do need one. Thank you. There's the stream crossing grant program in there now. Thank you, Brian. So, or maybe that was Will, I can't tell, whatever, thanks. So in Washington County, in Cooper, in Whiting, in, boy, we got more than that. Where were they? Doesn't matter. If you go to that web page, you can not only see how to apply for the money, but they've posted all of the previous grant applications. And so you can see what got funded and what works. And that's a really good way to prepare your grant application, is to go, okay, what works? And what do they like? What do I need to have? So a really powerful way to apply for that money, I have found, is to use Shore and Harbor to get your design done. Then you've got your design in order to apply for the culvert money, so you're ready to go. The culvert money, actually, the stream crossing, does not require you to have a design, but let's face it, if you've already got a design, you're ahead of the game. So that's what I always advise towns to do, is even if they had to spend their own money, 10 grand, hire an engineer, get a design, and then put in your application, and you're going to be more competitive, even though it's not required. And even some of these tiny towns, they see the value in that. Because I mean, putting an application together, it takes time. You know, it's not fun to apply and get denied and then wait a whole 6 months to a year to apply again. So, so I always advise, even if they don't require you to have a design, just at least get a preliminary, get a hydrological assessment done by an engineer. You may not have stamped drawings, but get an engineer to really help you, because in addition, they're going to give you a reasonable cost estimate. I mean, a planner is going to help you write the grant. I have written a bazillion of them, but I'm not an engineer. But if you get an engineer, at least to get you to the point where your numbers are rational, you're way ahead of the game, and it's proven successful for me in Washington County. So anyway, that's the state level. The federal level, let me give you an example with Machias, where it's larger money. So in this instance, Machias is already, as are some other towns, but they're really vulnerable. Their sewage treatment plant, which is right near the downtown, and their whole downtown has multiple areas that are already below base flood elevation. They're already seeing flooding and upwelling through their storm waters, which is supposed to drain. It's coming up at high tides, king tides, during the winter, throughout the whole year. They're already having significant issues. So what we did with starting with a coastal community grant, is we hired an engineer to do a feasibility analysis for what would it cost, or what would be the range of feasible alternatives to build a seawall to protect the downtown and to protect the sewage treatment plant. That resulting analysis, which, you know, we only had about 60 grand, we used to then apply for here it comes, FEMA pre-disaster mitigation planning grant. I think I missed a word in there, but anyways, it's a long name. And they landed it. So that got us $200,000, which they are now spending to get the full engineering work done. You know, coming up with $200,000 is not easy for a tiny town in Down East Maine. So they used a small harbor improvement program that's out of Maine DOT grant for their boat launch improvements, because that would have to be tied into this seawall. So there's their local share. Remember that important local share or local match, in order for them to get the $200,000 to do the full engineering. So then now when that's done, they are, as the saying goes, shovel ready. Then they can apply for the actual pre-disaster mitigation grant, which, these numbers, 10 million or 11 million or 9 million, they're big. That's the scale. So the federal money there, again, is FEMA pre-disaster mitigation, and it's actual construction of that seawall and that protected area for the sewage treatment plant. So it's that kind of use the state 20 to 30 to 50 grand to get yourself ready for the next 200 grand to get yourself ready for the big bucks. That's the thinking.
This is so helpful, and it's a great sort of example of why that recommendation that your working group proposed about technical assistance and the resources to answer these questions for communities is just so important, because these aren't
build the capacity. Yes.
Yeah, they're not unknown. You clearly, how how to navigate this, but we've got to make it easy for you to put that knowledge into the hands of the people in all of our little towns.
Right. Yeah,
so thank you.
They're volunteers.
Right, right.
And their day job is teaching or something. They don't know this stuff. And why should they have to know? All those towns have to know this stuff. So absolutely. And that's the efficiency and the coordination. Another way that we used in Washington County, we used the Coastal Communities grants, is we identified in Eastport, Lubec, Machiasport, Jonesport, and Millbridge. So really from the eastern end of the county to the west, areas of vulnerability. Some of them were culverts, some of them were road washouts, some of them were access to working waterfront facilities where they had problems. And fortunately, they'd identified them. Maybe some of those towns have got, have prepared and really examined their resilience or their vulnerabilities. Maybe some of them hadn't, but these at least had identified those projects. So we applied for a Coastal Communities grant to get the engineering for all those projects in one grant. And what that allowed me to do was to put out one RFP and secure the services of one contractor to provide services to all of those towns. Rather than each town having to apply for the grant, put out an RFP, get a different consultant, it makes sense for the consultants too. They'd far rather do 5 projects than one, or a $60,000 contract than a $10,000. So that's the kind of thinking that really helps in terms of this efficiency that we so need to address as we're challenged economically.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you. Let's switch gears for a few minutes and talk about some of those intersections. I think one of the things that makes your working group so interesting is the way you're really looking comprehensively at all parts of Maine communities. So health and infrastructure and emergency planning. We had a question about where high-speed internet fits into that. And so much of this coordination can happen online, but we need everybody to have access. And did your group look at internet access as part of our climate response?
Our group did not directly. I mean, it always comes up. It did come up, trying to think, I think in the Buildings, Housing, and Infrastructure group, it came up. It has absolutely come up in the Economic Recovery group and the committee that was established, as COVID landed on us. And so one of the questions that I just asked at, the steering committee meeting with the Climate Council we just had was, what's going on in terms of integrating the recommendations of the Climate Council with the recommendations of the Economic Recovery Committee? And Hannah Pingree specifically indicated that absolutely we're looking to interweave the recommendations. So, it didn't come up directly, but with our group, but it's absolutely front of mind with the economic recovery group recommendations. And as we weave the work together of both of these groups, it's there. I mean, because it's so important, and we've needed it so much.
We have, and we really have demonstrated just how much of our lives we can conduct online,
Yeah.
and if we have the resources in place. And in fact, the transportation working group, I think, recommended broadband as a way to reduce vehicle miles traveled. We don't need to drive all over the state, it turns out. So that's one really interesting thing. Another intersection that some of our participants were interested in is the link between climate resilience and workforce training, especially for young workers who may be entering the job market for the first time in a particularly strange and challenging job market. Did your group contemplate any of that?
We didn't in our recommendations, but that was the thing that came that everyone was like, it just lit when it came out from the outreach that Becca's group did in public health, this idea of a Maine Conservation Corps for workforce development. And like I was saying, I think the opportunities there they cross virtually every sector. The construction trades, engineering, design, GIS mapping, regulation, legal, real estate, finance. It hits everything. And if we can really think through what that would look like in terms of a core, if you will, modeled on like AmeriCorps, but also mentoring and internships. And because we are also, there is the graying of the workforce going on here. And as people like me, choose to go out in the garden or kayak this afternoon instead of work all the time, which I'd love to do, I would love to see a mentoring program that really identifies for young people what those opportunities are. And I'm convinced that in the engineering work, architecture, green buildings, I mean, it's everywhere. There is an opportunity for workforce development that addresses the entire economic sector, if we look at it that way,
Absolutely, it is really exciting to think about how can we look at all of these segments of our economy through a climate lens, right? And how can we solve our climate crisis by solving a bunch of other problems at the same time?
Yeah.
One of those really big challenges that is cross-cutting and top of mind is racial and economic justice. And we had a question about how your working group sort of thought about that and thought about equity. I know we heard just this week from in the steering committee level that there's an equity audit going on right now through the Mitchell Center. So it's a sort of different level of analysis, but what was the conversation like in your working group?
I would say that it was insufficient. It was there, but it was insufficient. I think the areas that we covered had to do with some of the disparities between, because we were looking at through the municipal perspective as opposed to sort of the individual communities perspective. So I think that's the part of it that was a bit insufficient. But from the municipal side of things, the equity conversation had more to do with really limited capacity in rural areas, even along the coast, where you've got volunteers and limited both you know, institutional as well as financial capacity to work. And so that's where one of the things that was recommended was we said, okay, incentivize cooperation or incentivize the getting of money for infrastructure improvements by, you got to have a resilience plan. Well, someone said, little towns are not going to have resilience plans. And so, well, when we moved through that, it was, okay, you should lower the bar for a small town with, their issues are some roads and some culverts. It doesn't go much further than that. So don't require this full-blown resilience plan that you might need in, you know, a Lewiston, Auburn, a Portland, a Saco, for instance. And so encourage collaboration, do it regionally, identify what your vulnerabilities are, and you're in. You've got your resilience plan. You don't have to make it a high bar for small rural communities, because you don't want to shut them out of, say, the culvert money that they need, and that they need, say, on a road that is, it's their road, they're responsible. But if you look bigger picture, it may be the evacuation route for the entire region. So think of it in those terms, to not set the bar too high when you don't need to. And I think that is an equity consideration.
That's a great point. And one of your co-chairs, Becca Boulos, who's the head of the Maine Public Health Association, is also on the call and just sent me a message saying, I want to say how our group talked about it too.
Yes,
so
please,
Becca,
please.
Let me see.
I unmute.
Oh, there you go. Excellent. Becca, go for it.
Thank you. I know that we're ending on time, or we're getting close to the end of time. I just wanted to say our conversation was a little bit different than what Judy was describing for her group. Ours focused more on data and being able to disaggregate data by different demographic factors, so we can identify where there are populations that are disproportionately experiencing the effects of climate change, and be able to design interventions accordingly. And we also talked about it in the context of using trusted health professionals in different communities. So, for example, community health workers to work with different populations. And we're certainly seeing that now with the state's response to COVID and the importance of having trusted health professionals. And that'll certainly continue to be true as we address climate change. So I just wanted to chime in real quick there with that. So thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you, Becca, and for both the content there and the reminder that this is really a team effort. We have just a wealth of knowledge and experience in all different fields across the state, but we've all come together to put our climate lens in focus and to work together. And I'm just so grateful that you are on the call today. Grateful to you, Judy, for your fantastic presentation. You are two of my favorite colleagues and most treasured members of the Climate Council, so thank you for all of your work. Thank you to everybody who joined us today. We will email out a brief survey a little bit later this afternoon and include a link to today's presentation. If you enjoyed this conversation today, I encourage you to join future Lunch and Learns. We're here every Friday from noon to 1. And next week, our topic is holding big oil accountable. So we'll have a speaker, Megan Matthews from the Center for Climate Integrity, and she'll help us explore both Maine's climate impacts and the associated financial costs, which we got a little bit of insight into today, and then ask about the fossil fuel industry's history and relationship with all of those costs, and help answer the question, who should pay for it all? Thanks, Judy. I know you're headed out to go kayaking. I hope everyone else has a great afternoon and a fabulous weekend as well. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Kathleen.